What is up, everyone? Welcome to another edition of Swinging Sunday Scan for May the 15th, 2022. Today, the plan is we will review the markets and get an idea of our bias on the direction of the market for the week to come. We're going to look at some previous ideas in our other episodes, and then we're going to look at some new ideas that we captured from our most recent scan. Before we jump in though, guys, if at any point any of this content helps you out in any way, please do me a favor and hit that like button. If you want to see more content like this in the future, hit subscribe. Click that bell if you want to get notifications anytime I put out new content. Let's jump in. Alright, we're looking at the S&P 500 E-mini futures, the ES. You can use the SPY, which is the S&P 500 ETF. Last week, we were talking about this 4,100 level of support as a very key level to watch. We're looking at two scenarios, one where we would possibly break down, bounce, and head up into this 4,200 area and then reverse back to the downside. Or we're possibly looking at a bounce around the 4,100 area with an extension maybe around the 4,300 area and then a reversal back down through to the downside. The third scenario was also something to consider, which was basically just a breakdown and continuation with a big leg down. We did see a breakdown and we did put in a pretty decent move. However, on Thursday, we put in a pretty decent bottoming tail. And on Friday, we put in a pretty wide range green day. So in order for the third scenario for me to happen this week, we would have to see a continuation pass through this bottoming tail and continue downwards. Anything that continues sideways or up for me would be a potential confirmation of one of our first two scenarios, which would be basically a bounce and then a reversal to the downside. So for this week, with this potential bounce here, which for me I'm reading as a breakdown failure, I'm going to be looking at some longs. Last week we were talking about looking at the current state of the market as pretty neutral. So last week I was looking at both long and shorts. I didn't see any quality longs materialize. So I did end up getting into three different short ideas. I have to be honest, guys, I'm looking back and thinking I may have been a bit impatient, but we'll go over that in a minute. So in short, the plan would be looking at getting into some longs for a potential short-term bounce on the market with anything that is showing relative strength. And then next week is probably around the time where we might see that extension towards the upside, where I'll be preparing for some shorts. Let's get into some previous ideas. First, I'm going to share some of my open and closed positions. NBR is a full stop for me. This one had a little bit of a bounce on its first go, which was on May the 4th, and then since failed, broke through my stop, and looks like a potential bounce, but my plan is very strict about re-entering long or short trades that have failed significantly. If they peekabooed and continued in my direction, I may consider getting back in, but this one failed pretty significantly, held below my stop. This is a very clear no re-entry trade. This one is gone. On to the next. RLYB. This is one that we mentioned last week. I did like that this one was putting in a sort of like a double top retest with two topping tails. One on this day here and one on this day here. I got into this name and we started kind of chopping around. So this one is not getting off to a good start, but if we can break the lows here below $9, I think this one will be off to the races. The other problem of this one is my target is way down here. So my expectation for this trade is likely not to go to full target, but if I can get 1 to 2 R, maybe take out some at $7 and maybe ride the rest out to around maybe 5. I'm okay with that. We'll see how this one shapes up. I tend to trail on daily pivots. So even if we grind down and get some trend to the downside, we can slowly remove our risk as it continues down. ARW is another one we mentioned last week. This one, I did mention that it bounced pretty hard and kind of cleared what looked like a little bit of a trend line here. In the previous video, I did mention that made this trade look a little less attractive. I think last week I was a bit impatient. I was seeing the market continue down. These entries materialized. I got impatient and said, you know what? The trade is here. I'm just going to take it. And whether or not I'm feeling regret, it's hard to tell. But ending the week, all of these open trades, including the next one I will show you, are currently in the red. So if I'll stop out at the beginning of next week, I'm going to look at a full 3-hour stop to start the week on Monday. We shall see what happens. Let's go to the last one I'm in. PTSI. This one I have no regrets. This one I've looked at from many different angles, and especially on the higher time frame, like the weekly. We're heading into this great resistance area here. I have a feeling like this one has potential all the way down to $20. Whether this one works or not, I'm happy with this entry. RLYB, ARW, the previous 2 trades we looked at. I probably should have maybe only took one of those to reduce my exposure on the short side, given that I wasn't taking these on a extension on the market, rather on a breakdown, which I mentioned last week is typically not something I normally do. So all we can do now is wait and see and manage the trades as per our plan. I have one more short trade with orders currently in the system. I may end up canceling this for the reasons that I mentioned before. I think I'd rather wait for that extension on the market before getting into any more short trades. However, I'd be interested in finding some longs. A previous idea we mentioned in a previous week was HALO. This one, I have not entered this trade long. However, over this $49 area would have been my entry. We had a decent day on Friday. This has pretty decent room to this pivot up here. This would have been a decent trade. However, I did mention I didn't like this blip here. This blip is, to me, basically looks like an attempt at a bounce, but a failure. And what I mentioned in the previous week was this sometimes can be a sign of a continuation of another bounce and a failure, another bounce and a failure as it continues down. But more or less, this wasn't a bad entry. We are pretty far ways away from this pivot. So if anything, it should have held here if this was a strong stock, but it didn't. So I stayed away from this one, but we'll watch and see what happens with HALO. RBA, this was one we had success short here. However, now after earnings, again, another reason why we don't hold through earnings. There was a huge bounce. To me, this looks super bullish now. This one, I'm not looking for any sort of entry for the time being. Something that would make me very interested in entering this stock long would basically be a little bit more of an extension towards the upside, a reversal down to here, and then we'd be basically looking at the entry at this point right here. This would be a perfect retracement area to this support level, which would be at this pivot around the $76 area. And throughout the history of the stock, if you look at the weekly chart here, it does have the ability to trend for quite some time. I've actually had a few winners on this one long through this stint here, and I tend to watch names that continue to trend in an orderly manner, just because I find that they do offer more opportunities for my type of entries. Another idea that we mentioned the other week, FTS, we were saying that this one was showing some great relative strength on Friday of the week before last week, where the market put in a small red doji bar with a bottoming tail, and this put in a large green bar. It's since put in another decent green bar. We had a bit of a topping tail doji bar on the following day, but the remainder of the week we've held most of these gains while the market was basically tanking. So we could see some strength if the market puts in another bounce, and we'll see what happens if it comes up and tests the $65 area. I mentioned the other week that I'd be interested in maybe entering this if it came down and put in a double retest. I think at this point, even if it came all the way back down, I would not be interested. If it retraced and retested after this one green bar, that would be fine. But after this big green bar and holding its highs, if it loses its highs now and retests, I wouldn't really consider that a possible entry. I'd consider that more of like a sign of weakness and something I'd want to stay away from. So FDS is gone, but I'll be watching this one because there's something to learn in every stock. We mentioned BOOM last week. No entry here. This one got really sloppy. What I wanted to see was a more of an extension into this red line, similar to what happened here. We didn't get it. Kind of chopped around. On to the next. As I was scanning for new long ideas, what ended up happening was these next following 3 stocks actually showed up on my scanner, but they were already on my watch list. So maybe they were just meant to be. FMC, I'm looking at getting in this name long. Last week, we had some pretty wide range red bars, which for the distance to the top of the pivot wasn't providing a great risk to reward opportunity. However, now we're putting in a bit of a narrower range, plus we're even further extended from the pivot, which gives us more of a better risk to reward. Plus, we're heading into a pretty significant monthly double top support area where we had resistance here, which is now becoming support. And we put in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days of holding a support area while the market was tanking. So we have some relative strength, we have a support area, we have extension, we have risk to reward. This one checks a lot of boxes. I'm probably going to get in this one with an order over this 118.20 area, and we're hoping for a bounce, potentially timing it with the market up towards the 140 area. ESTA, similar to the last name, last week, this one had some pretty wide red bars. And again, similar to the last one, it just wasn't providing a good risk to reward to the top of this pivot. And again, like the last one, we're putting in some narrow range bars. We're at a support area here. The main concern on this one is the fact that overall, this stock has been putting in what looks like a decent downtrend. But since this increase here on the weekly has since popped above this resistance area here, it didn't hold it, but it showed that there was still some buyers hanging out up in this area, which means that there is a potential that at this support level here, when this took off, there still may be buyers ready to pick this stock up and again continue rallying in the same way. This trade idea here is actually for 4R. So really 3R is going to be around this $80 area, and 2R is around the 50% retracement area. So even if we're looking at this and saying, well, it's hard to expect that this stock before earnings is going to go that entire distance when in this, even though it did it in this time here, to do it after such a big decline after this big move is expecting a lot from the stock. But I think it's worth a shot, and if we're going to trail it out, we're able to remove our risk along the way. This is a great spot, I think, to get in, and that's ESTA. Another one that showed up on my scanner that was already on my watch list was TNP. So on the daily, which is typically the chart that I use as my entry, this honestly looks like just slop, chop, junk, no good, no entry. However, what I am looking at and I'm kind of going to take a chance on, because this is kind of falls a little bit outside of my typical pattern, is I'm looking at the higher time frame. So if you're not familiar with multiple time frame analysis, it is very important to trading in all aspects. And what I'm doing here is I'm taking the daily chart. I'm using what I typically use as my entry, but I'm basing my thesis on another time frame, which is the weekly and the monthly. So if you look at the monthly here, it put in a pretty astounding double bottom around the $7 area. During this time, it put in a pivot around this $11 to $10 area, spiked close to $12. And then even here on the weekly, it put in another bounce around and topped out around the $11 area again. It has since spiked above this $11 area and is currently chopping around this $12 area. Psychologically, to me, this looks like it's chewing through a lot of sellers that have probably either bought in or were previously selling up in this area already, but it's holding. It's not dipping below its pivots, which is below this $10 980 area. On the higher time frame, this is the first time that it's holding near this red line, which is the 50 period moving average, and it's gone sideways without breaking this $6.74 area. Really, if you were to look at this from a larger time frame perspective, this one has room all the way up to $40 in a few months. So this one has a lot of boxes to tick on the larger time frame. And although this one doesn't quite match my pattern on the daily, I am going to consider taking this one based on the higher time frame. LOPE, I like this one similar to the last one based on the monthly chart. We did put in a high here, a higher low here, and a higher higher, and it looks like we're about to put in a higher low here. But what you'll find on the daily chart is this chart is quite overlapping and a bit choppy. So entering in on the daily with candles that overlap quite a bit can possibly shake you out more likely than a chart that is moving in an orderly fashion with less overlap. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to look to see how this week's bar close on the weekly chart and determine if we can get an entry based on the weekly chart's highs and lows of this week's bar. So we'll see what happens on LOPE. We have a short idea, NOMD. This one, we're looking for a similar move here where we extended into the 50 period MA and possibly look for a reversal back to the downside heading towards the $17 area. I wouldn't necessarily be super interested if the extension gets closer to this $23 area. I prefer to stay below the $22 area, mostly because a full retracement would probably look more bullish than a possible reversal to the downside. But ideally what we'd look for is some narrow range bars somewhere between this $21 to $22 area with a good risk to reward down to the $17 area. CPNG is a similar idea. We had some success with this one in the past from March the 4th. What happened on March the 4th is we saw a bounce into what was a support area but now becoming a resistance area. We took it short with a decent move to the downside. We're basically going to look for a similar idea where we have what was a support area here that was tested once and twice and broke down through this area with a decent move. This stock is now bouncing and we're hoping to test this area here with a possible reversal to the downside. So hopefully not necessarily next week, but maybe the week before, we get an extension up in here. We maybe pierce or get close to this red 50 period moving average line, and we can look for a entry to the downside. Thanks a lot, guys. I really appreciate you sticking it out to the end. This year we saw quite a bit of volatility in the markets, and it's been a pretty interesting swing trading year thus far. I think this volatility has provided quite a bit of opportunities, and I'm hoping it plays out the same the rest of the year and possibly into 2023. If any of this content helped you guys out in any way, please do me a huge favor and click that like button. Click subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future. Click the bell if you want to get notifications anytime I post new content. That's it, guys. Trade safe, trade with a plan, be well, and we'll catch you on the next one.